All right, so we're diving deep today. And you guys sent in some really cool stuff about Benjamin Harrison, the 23rd president.
Yeah, he's definitely one of the more, shall we say, under the radar presidents.
Yeah, under the radar. I like that. And to help us unpack all of this, we've got this episode of the American History Hit podcast.
Hosted by Don Wildman, right?
Yeah, exactly. And he's interviewing Alexander Petrie, who's, get this, a humor columnist for the Washington Post.
Humor columnist, huh? Interesting choice for a presidential deep dive. What's the angle there?
Well, it turns out Petrie's got a bit of a thing for Benjamin Harrison. In fact, he owns a jacket.
A jacket.
Yeah, with Harrison's face printed on it.
Wow. Okay, that's dedication.
It is.
Yeah.
All right, so let's jump in, shall we? First things first. Benjamin Harrison. Why isn't he a household name?
Right. It's like Lincoln, Washington, Roosevelt. Harrison just doesn't have that same ring to it.
Exactly. So where does this whole forgotten president thing come from? Is it deserved, or is there something more to him?
Okay, well, part of it might be that he's squeezed between two terms of Grover Cleveland, who's a much bigger personality.
Ah, so overshadowed.
Yeah, kinda. But Harrison's family history, now that's anything but forgettable. This guy's the grandson of President William Henry Harrison.
Wow, no kidding. And the great-grandson of someone who signed the Declaration of Independence. So, yeah, serious political lineage.
Absolutely. Talk about pressure. Can you imagine growing up with that kind of legacy?
No kidding. And speaking of legacy, there's this story about Harrison wearing special underwear during his inauguration.
Special underwear. What, like long johns?
Well, kinda. The story goes that he wore them to avoid getting sick, like his grandfather, who died from pneumonia, after giving a long speech in the cold without a coat.
Oh, right. Yeah. A bit of a family lesson learned the hard way.
Exactly. Makes you wonder if he was always kind of worried about living up to the family name.
Right. And speaking of image, he had this nickname, the Iceberg. Kind of a stark contrast to his opponent, Grover Cleveland, who was called Blue Jeans.
The iceberg versus blue jeans. Can you imagine those as campaign slogans today? It's like Firewall Joe versus TikTok Ted.
Ha! I love it.
But it does make you wonder, right? I mean, those nicknames. Do they reveal something deeper about their leadership styles? Like blue jeans, relatable, everyman. But the iceberg, that's, I don't know, more mysterious.
Maybe even aloof. Yeah, that could be why he's less remembered.
Yeah, maybe.
It's also interesting because he was supposedly a fantastic public speaker. The bigger the crowd, the better. But apparently in small groups, he was really awkward. There's even an anecdote about his wife.
His wife. What does she do?
She carried flowers with her so she
Ah.
could avoid shaking hands.
Wow. So the president was amazing on stage but couldn't handle a cocktail party. That's fascinating. You don't often hear about that kind of contrast. Do you think that played a role in how people saw him?
It's possible. I mean, it definitely challenges our assumptions about what a president should be like.
Right. Like maybe Harrison's real strength was in his ideas, not his personality.
Exactly.
So let's talk about those ideas. Petrie mentions this campaign song, What's the Matter with Harrison? He's all right.
It's catchy, right?
Yeah. It sounds super simple, but is there something more to it?
Well, it reflects a really important shift in American politics. You see, before Harrison and Cleveland, it was considered, well, kind of undignified for presidential candidates to actively campaign.
Really?
Yeah. They relied on other people to stump for them. But with Harrison, you see this move toward modern political branding, the need to connect directly with voters. And campaign songs were a totally new way to do that.
So even with the iceberg thing, he was a pioneer in how he campaigned.
Yeah.
That's wild. It makes me wonder, though, what kind of president was he once he got into office?
Yeah, that's the big question. Was he as reserved in his policies as he seemed to be in person?
Right. Well, according to Petrie, he signed over 500 laws. That's more than a lot of presidents. And he was big on conservation, naval expansion, even civil rights.
Yeah.
Sounds a bit like Teddy Roosevelt in some ways.
Yeah, he really foreshadowed those activist presidents of the 20th century.
Hold on. Conservation. That's not what I expected from the iceberg. Sounds like there's more to this guy than meets the eye, both personally and politically.
Absolutely. For example, he was a big supporter of setting aside land for preservation, establishing those forest reserves.
Really?
Yeah, and he might have even had a hand in creating Yellowstone National Park.
Wow. So he wasn't just focused on expanding America's power, he also wanted to protect its natural beauty. Okay, color me intrigued.
Right. And there's another surprising detail about him. Petrie mentions a letter from Harrison's mom back when he was in college, expressing concern over his love of cucumbers.
Wait, cucumbers, what?
Yeah, seriously. It's in one of the sources.
That's hilarious. What was the deal with that? Was it like a health thing, or did he just really, really love cucumbers? I mean, I like a good cucumber salad, but
It's one of those little details that makes these historical figures so much more relatable, right?
totally. It reminds you that they weren't just names in a textbook. They had personalities, maybe strange eating habits.
And passions.
Exactly. So we've got the cucumber-loving, special underwear-wearing iceberg president. But we also can't forget about the serious stuff.
Right, like his role in westward expansion and how that impacted Native American relations.
Yeah, that's a crucial part of the story, especially considering things like the Wounded Knee Massacre, which happened during his presidency.
Absolutely. We'll definitely need to dig into that. It'll be interesting to see how he navigated that complex landscape. So we're talking Gilded Age here. Big industry, rising labor movements, lots of tension over economic policies.
Sounds like a recipe for, well, for a lot of drama.
Oh, there was plenty of drama. And Harrison, right in the thick of it, he was all about protectionist trade policies, tariff, that kind of thing, believed it was crucial for protecting American industries and jobs.
Right, and that's where the opossums come in.
The opossums.
Yeah, his pet opossums, Mr. Protection and Mr. Reciprocity.
Oh, right. I'd almost forgotten about them.
Not exactly subtle messaging there, huh? Makes you wonder if that kind of straightforward thinking worked for him or against him in such a complex economic climate.
Well, that is the question, and it's especially relevant when you think about the McKinley Tariff Act. That passed during his presidency, by the way, and it raised tariff rates to their highest levels ever.
Wow, that's a bold move. Had to have some serious ripple effects, right?
Yeah.
What happened? What were the long-term consequences of something like that?
It's a bit of a mixed bag. Some industries thrived because they had less competition from foreign goods, but others struggled because, the raw materials they needed from overseas were suddenly way more expensive.
Ah, I see.
And of course, it hit consumers hard, too. Prices went up across the board.
So not exactly a win-win. It sounds like Harrison's approach was very much about picking sides, even if it meant some folks had to pay the price.
You could say that. And this protectionist attitude, it really comes through in his handling of labor relations, too. Remember, lots of strikes and unrest at that time, workers pushing for better conditions. And Harrison, well, he often sided with the business owners. He really believed in maintaining order, above all else, even if it meant sending in federal troops to break up strikes.
So stability over workers' concerns. Like with the Homestead strike in '92, that was a brutal clash between steelworkers and those Pinkerton detectives.
Exactly. And his response to that strike, it sent a really clear message about where his priorities lay property rights and keeping things calm, even if it meant using force.
It's interesting to think about how his personality, that whole iceberg image, maybe influenced his actions. Do you think he was, I don't know, emotionally detached from the real human cost of these policies?
It's a tough question. Historians still debate that one. Hard to say what was really going on in his head, but it definitely makes you think about the tough calls leaders have to make.
Right. And the fact that they're almost always going to be winners and losers.
Yeah, exactly.
So we've talked a lot about Harrison, the politician, the president, but what about Harrison, the man? I know our sources mentioned some personal anecdotes that give us a glimpse into his life outside the White House.
Oh, yeah. What about that story with his grandson's runaway goat cart and Old Whiskers, the presidential goat?
Old Whiskers. That's amazing. I mean, it just completely changes your perception of the guy. You go from this stern iceberg president to a loving grandpa chasing after a runaway goat cart.
It's adorable, right?
Totally. Makes him seem so much more human.
Exactly. And it's a good reminder that these historical figures, they had families, they had passions.
And probably a whole lot of chaos in their lives, just like the rest of us.
Absolutely. But speaking of chaos, life wasn't all runaway goats and cucumber snacks for Harrison. There's that deeply tragic event we need to talk about, the death of his first wife, Caroline, just before the '92 election.
Oh, right.
A really sad chapter in his story. Caroline was, by all accounts, a much-loved First Lady, really smart and dedicated to social causes. Her passing was devastating for Harrison, both personally and, politically, too.
Yeah, I can only imagine. Especially with the election looming. Did he ever talk about how he coped with that loss?
He was a pretty private guy, so there aren't a ton of first-hand accounts of his emotional state, but we do know he eventually remarried. His deceased wife's niece, actually, married Dimmick Harrison.
Wow, really?
Yeah, and they even had a daughter together.
That's quite a turn of events. Speaks to his capacity for love and resilience, I guess, to find happiness again after such a huge loss.
Definitely. There's a sense of hope in that part of his story. It's a reminder that even after tragedy, life goes on.
It is. And it's a side of him you don't often hear about, which makes it even more fascinating. We've seen him as the politician, the president, the grandfather, the grieving husband. It's a pretty incredible arc when you think about it.
It really is. And as we head toward the end of this deep dive, it makes you wonder how all these different pieces of his life fit together to create his legacy. What's his lasting image? Why is he so often considered a forgotten president?
Right. That's the big question we've been grappling with. Why doesn't he have the same name recognition as some of his contemporaries?
Well, for one, he was literally bookended by Grover Cleveland, a much bigger personality, right? So there's that shadow effect.
Right. Like he was almost a historical interlude, a pause between two acts of the Grover Cleveland show.
Ah, that's a great way to put it. But that doesn't mean his presidency was insignificant. He did a lot, especially in areas like conservation and economic policy, and he definitely expanded presidential power.
So what's the missing piece then? Why haven't those accomplishments translated into more recognition?
Maybe it has to do with his personality. He wasn't this larger-than-life figure like, say, Teddy Roosevelt. He was reserved, intellectual, and perhaps not as good at playing the game of politics in the Gilded Age.
More substance than style, which doesn't always capture people's attention, I guess.
Yeah,
But maybe that's exactly why he's worth another look, because there's more to him than meets the eye.
exactly. And as we get into the final part of this deep dive, we're going to uncover a side of Benjamin Harrison that might surprise you. A side that reveals his lasting impact, even if it's not widely known.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. Harrison's personality, his policies, his personal life, even his love of cucumbers.
Don't forget the special underwear.
Oh, yeah, right, the special underwear. But there's one piece of the puzzle we haven't really talked about yet, his post-presidency. What did the iceberg do after leaving the White House?
Well, you'd think after all that, he'd just want to, kick back, relax, maybe take up cucumber farming.
Right.
But that's not what he did at all. He actually dove headfirst back into the legal world, went back to his law practice, and started giving all these lectures on law and international affairs.
So even after being president, he still had that drive, that need to contribute, to use his knowledge and experience to, I don't know, make a difference.
Exactly. And this is where things get really interesting. Harrison took on this case that had massive implications for international law and diplomacy. He represented Venezuela in a boundary dispute.
A boundary dispute. With who?
With British Guiana. It's Guyana now.
Oh, wow. So he's going up against a British colony. That's a bit of a David and Goliath situation, isn't it? What was the big deal with this boundary? What was at stake?
It was this huge territory, incredibly rich in resources, especially gold. And Britain, obviously a major world power back then, they were basically trying to, flex their muscles and claim the whole region. Venezuela, a much smaller country, they turned to Harrison for help.
So it's not just a legal case. It's about standing up to an empire. That's intense. What was his strategy? I mean, how do you even begin to argue against a superpower like Britain?
Well, Harrison, he argued that the U.S., under the Monroe Doctrine, had a vested interest in preventing European powers from expanding their influence in the Western Hemisphere. The whole Europe stay out of our backyard thing.
Ah, right.
He used that plus a bunch of historical precedents and legal arguments to build this really compelling case for Venezuela.
So basically he was saying, Britain, you're overstepping your bounds and the U.S. isn't going to stand for it. Pretty bold move. Did it work? Did he win the case?
He did. Well, sort of. His arguments help pave the way for international arbitration. Basically, when a neutral third party steps in to settle a dispute between countries, a way to avoid war, resolve things peacefully.
Hold on. Are you saying that Benjamin Harrison, this forgotten president, helped shape the way countries handle these big global conflicts?
You could say that. His work on the Venezuela boundary dispute was a big step towards establishing the Permanent Court of Arbitration at The Hague. And that's a major milestone in international law and how we think about resolving conflict peacefully.
Wow, that's amazing. We started this deep dive thinking about a president who wore special underwear and loved cucumbers, and now we're talking about his impact on global diplomacy. This is why I love these deep dives. There's always more to the story.
Always. And that's the beauty of it, right? We've gone beyond the surface, beyond the simple narratives, and uncovered the true complexities of Benjamin Harrison.
So after all of this, what's the biggest takeaway for you? What will you remember most about Benjamin Harrison?
Honestly, it's that reminder to never underestimate anyone, especially those who might seem quiet or unassuming. Harrison was the iceberg, but underneath that, he was a man with deep convictions and a sharp mind. He shaped American policy, championed conservation, and even left his mark on international law.
It makes you wonder how many other forgotten figures are out there, just waiting for their stories to be rediscovered.
Right. And it makes you think about our own lives, too. The people and events around us that we might be taking for granted. What happens if we apply that same curiosity, that same deep dive spirit to everything?
That's a great question, and a perfect note to end on, I think. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey of discovery.
It's been a pleasure.
And to all of you listening, until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.